You will be stunned to uncover the truth regarding the appearance and skin color of Jesus Christ. Was he really the figure we have come to envision? There is a letter written by Pontius Pilate to the Roman Emperor Tiberius that offers shocking insights into the physical appearance of Jesus. Details that are never mentioned in the Bible. This letter goes beyond physical attributes, revealing Pilate's accounts of Jesus' miracles, his trial, crucifixion, and, incredibly, his resurrection. But what exactly does this letter reveal? What could Pilate have shared with the emperor regarding the resurrection of the Son of God? And what of Jesus' true appearance? Pilate begins his letter by addressing Tiberius. "Greetings, Majesty." He proceeds to recount the events in his province, which he describes as so extraordinary that he feels compelled to share them in full detail, convinced that they may have profound implications for the future of the empire. Pilate writes that he feels as if the gods have turned their backs on Rome, and he confesses that from the moment he took over governance of Judea, his life has been fraught with challenges. Pilate goes on to lament that the moment he assumed his post, things went terribly wrong. His tenure, he admits, has been cursed by a series of misfortunes. Upon his arrival in Jerusalem, Pilate takes control of the praetorium and prepares for a grand banquet, inviting a tetrarch from Galilee, the high priest, and various officials. However, when the time arrived, no one showed up. Pilate interpreted this as an insult to his authority and to the Roman Empire itself. Some days later, the high priest did pay Pilate a visit, but his demeanor was anything but friendly. He came with a serious expression, claiming that his religion prohibited him from dining with Romans. Though Pilate could see that the priest's face betrayed him, he wasn't being truthful. Pilate accepted the excuse but quickly realized that both the priest and his followers harbored deep opposition to Roman rule. He warns that the Roman Empire should remain vigilant of these high priests, for they would betray even their closest allies for the sake of power and wealth. Pilate writes that Jerusalem is one of the most difficult places to govern. Its people are deeply rebellious, and he lives in a constant state of fear that an uprising is just around the corner. With only a handful of soldiers at his disposal, including just one centurion and a mere 100 men, Pilate had to request reinforcements from the governor of Syria. The response was disheartening. The governor had barely enough troops to protect his own province, let alone assist Pilate. The ambition of Rome to expand seems to outweigh its capacity to protect its current dominions. Pilate reflects. He fears that this imbalance may eventually lead to the downfall of their empire. Pilate admits to avoiding direct engagement with the people, fearing the influence of the priests who could incite violent uprisings. Nevertheless, he made an effort to understand the concerns of the local population. Among the many rumors he had heard, one in particular stood out to him. The people spoke of a young man from Galilee, a preacher who was teaching a new doctrine, claiming to speak on behalf of a God who had sent him. At first, Pilate suspected that this man might be attempting to stir the population against the Roman Empire. But he soon realized this was not the case. Jesus of Nazareth, as Pilate learned, was not in conflict with Rome. He seemed, in fact, more sympathetic to Roman authority than to the Jewish authorities who opposed them. Pilate recalls an encounter in which, while passing through the city, he observed a large crowd gathered around a young man who stood leaning against a tree. Speaking softly yet with authority, Pilate learned that this man was none other than Jesus. Pilate admits that he was not surprised by this. Jesus had a way of standing out among those who followed him. Rather than interrupting the scene, Pilate decided to allow the moment to pass, but he instructed his secretary, Leus, to blend into the crowd and report back on Jesus' teachings. Leus, a man who spoke Hebrew fluently and who had been loyal to Pilate's administration, returned with an account of what Jesus had said. Leus reported that Jesus' words were unlike anything Pilate had encountered in the works of philosophers. His wisdom was profound, transcending the thoughts of men like Socrates and Plato. One of the many rebels in Jerusalem asked Jesus whether it was right to pay taxes to Caesar. Jesus responded, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's." Pilate was struck by the depth of this reply. He writes that this wisdom was one of the reasons he chose to release Jesus despite having the power to arrest him or exile him. Pilate further justifies his decision by emphasizing that Jesus was not a rebel or an agitator. His teachings were rooted in logic and justice. principles that aligned with the Roman ideal of governance. Pilate reflects that he gave Jesus the freedom to speak, to gather, and to teach without interference. Pilate admits that if, in the future, the Roman gods and traditions were replaced by the teachings of Jesus, it would be his decision to allow this freedom that might ultimately lead to the downfall of Rome. Pilate views this as an unfortunate inevitability, something that the Jews may call providence and the Romans may refer to as fate. This freedom, however, angered the wealthier Jewish leaders, particularly the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus had a biting criticism of their hypocrisy, calling them serpents and accusing them of being well-decorated tombs, beautiful on the outside, but full of death within. He condemned their social elitism and emphasized that humility was more valuable in God's eyes than any worldly status. Pilate received frequent complaints about Jesus' boldness, as his words were seen as dangerous. The high priests warned him that something bad might happen to Jesus and reminded him of Jerusalem's history of stoning those who declared themselves to be prophets. There were even talks of a petition being sent to Caesar to remove Pilate for his leniency towards Jesus. But the Senate stood by his decisions, promising reinforcements after the Persian War. In the end, Pilate decided to take direct action, aiming to restore peace in Jerusalem. Without resorting to humiliation or disrespect, he invited Jesus to the praetorium for a meeting. Jesus arrived, and Pilate, though of Roman and Spanish heritage, found himself momentarily overcome with awe. He stood on the balcony, seemingly frozen in place as Jesus approached with calm serenity. Pilate was struck by Jesus' presence, describing it as something pure and unearthly, unlike anything he had ever encountered in the depictions of gods and heroes by Roman artists. There was nothing in Jesus' demeanor that repelled him. Instead, Pilate felt weak and too old to approach him. When Pilate finally spoke, his voice trembled as he addressed Jesus, acknowledging the years of freedom he had allowed Jesus to express his thoughts openly. He confessed that he had never encountered anyone with the same wisdom as Jesus, comparing his speech to that of the great philosophers, but even placing it above them. He also warned Jesus that his freedom of speech had attracted the ire of powerful enemies. Even within Pilate's own circle, some were furious with Pilate for allowing such an unorthodox figure to speak freely, accusing both Pilate and Jesus of threatening the Roman order. The words of Pilate echoed in my mind with growing tension. "You must be more cautious, Jesus. I implore you, do not provoke the people further, for your enemies are conspiring against you. They seek to exploit your pride, to turn the simple folk of Jerusalem against you and push me to act in accordance with Roman law." Jesus, however, did not flinch at the warning, his voice as calm and composed as ever. He replied, "Ruler of this earth, your words, though they may seem wise, do not come from true wisdom. Ask the mountain to halt in the valley, and it will only answer that it follows the immutable laws of nature set forth by the Creator. Only He knows where the waters flow." Jesus' words were as profound as they were unsettling. "I tell you the truth," he continued, "before the rose of Sharon blooms, the blood of the righteous will be spilled, but your blood will not be among them." Pilate, deeply moved by the serenity and depth of Jesus' speech, responded with heartfelt admiration, "I value your wisdom more than all the rebellious Pharisees who have twisted the freedoms granted to them by Rome. They conspire against Caesar, painting him as a tyrant while secretly seeking their own gains. These men, who have turned the faith of their people into a tool for their own ambition, do not see the danger. Like wolves, they wear the skin of sheep to achieve their wicked goals. I will protect you from them. Jesus, my praetorium will be a refuge for you, a place of safety day and night." But Jesus, ever calm, simply shook his head, his smile gentle yet resolute. "When the time comes," he said, "there will be no refuge for the Son of Man, neither upon the earth nor beneath it. The true refuge lies in the heavens. For what was written by the prophets will come to pass." Pilate, in a state of growing concern, repeated his insistence. "Young man," he said, "I fear you are compelling me to turn my advice into an order. The security of this province, which I am entrusted with, demands that you be more careful. Do not disregard my command. You must be mindful of the consequences, for the fate of this city and its people hangs in the balance. May happiness and peace accompany you. Farewell." To this, Jesus replied softly, "Prince of this earth, I did not come to bring disturbance, but rather peace, love, and charity. I was born on the same day that Augustus Caesar brought tranquility to the Roman Empire. The persecutions will not be because of me, but I know they will come as a result of others. I must follow the will of my Father, who has shown me the path I must walk. You cannot protect me from the sacrifices that are to come. You cannot keep the victim from the altar once it is time for the sacrifice." And with those words, Jesus turned and withdrew, fading from Pilate's sight like a distant light on the horizon. Pilate, for a moment, felt a great weight lift from his shoulders, for the presence of Jesus had been a burden too heavy to bear. Pilate knew that his role in this unfolding drama was one that would not be easy to escape. Herod, the ruler of the region, who was already of advanced age, had allied himself with the enemies of Jesus. He sought revenge, yet his position as king made him hesitant to act directly against Jesus. His vanity as a ruler clouded his judgment, and Pilate could see that Herod was afraid of the man from Nazareth. Even if he would not admit it publicly, Herod's visit to Pilate was brief and without significance. But before leaving, he asked Pilate his opinion on Jesus. Pilate, ever the diplomat, responded cautiously, "Jesus seems to be a sage, a man whose wisdom transcends the politics of our time. His teachings are not aimed against Rome, and as such, Rome has allowed him the freedom to speak." Herod's smile was mocking, and with a bow full of irony, he left Pilate, clearly dismissive of the Roman governor's leniency. Pilate, however, knew that tensions were rising in Jerusalem. The Passover festival was fast approaching, a time when the city always teemed with a restless, unruly crowd. Pilate's informants brought him word that the temple treasury had been used to bribe the people into demanding Jesus' death. As the crowds grew louder and more aggressive, Pilate, fearing an uprising, sent a letter to the governor of Syria, requesting reinforcements, 100 foot soldiers and 100 cavalrymen. The response, however, was not what he had hoped for. The governor, stretched thin by the demands of his own province, refused to send any aid, leaving Pilate isolated with only a handful of veterans in a city on the brink of chaos. It was in this tense atmosphere that Jesus was arrested, accused falsely of being a rebel against Rome. Despite knowing there was no real threat from Jesus, the people, fueled by their leaders, began shouting for his execution. The crowds, growing ever more volatile, united against him. The Herodians, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, despite their differences, all shared a hatred for Jesus. The Herodians and Sadducees, though their loyalties were divided, had long despised Jesus for his influence over the people, and they had never forgiven Pilate for his earlier actions, when he had entered the holy city with banners bearing the image of the emperor. The Pharisees, too, had long opposed Jesus, both for his criticisms of their social elitism and for his condemnation of their hypocrisy. This volatile mix of political intrigue and religious resentment culminated when Jesus was brought before the high priest. Caiaphas, in an act of feigned humility, sent Jesus to Pilate, requesting confirmation of his death sentence. Pilate, seeing no clear basis for such an action, suggested that the case be handled by Herod, as Jesus was from Galilee. Herod, pretending to show respect for Caesar's representative, sent the matter back to Pilate, leaving the responsibility squarely on his shoulders. Pilate's palace became a besieged fortress as the crowds outside grew ever more furious. Jesus, now surrounded by a multitude of rebels and followers from across Judea, stood before Pilate once again. A man who claimed to foresee the future fell to his knees before Pilate, warning him with great urgency. "Beware," he cried, "do not touch this man, for he is sacred. Last night, I saw him walking upon the waters, flying on the wings of the wind. He spoke to the storm, and even the fish obeyed him." The man went on, his voice trembling, "If you do not heed your wife's warnings, a great misfortune will fall upon you. Fear the curse of the Roman Senate. Fear the thrones of Caesar." At that moment, the marble steps of the praetorium trembled under the weight of the crowd, who had returned with Jesus. Pilate, surrounded by his guard, entered the halls of justice and demanded to know what the people wanted. Their answer was deafening: "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate, attempting to hold to Roman principles of justice, asked, "What crime has he committed?" The crowd's answer was a chorus of accusations. He has blasphemed, prophesied the destruction of the temple, and declared himself the Son of God, the King of the Jews. Pilate, still trying to cling to the idea of justice, replied, Roman law does not condemn someone to death for such claims. Yet, despite his best efforts, the shouts of the crowd grew louder and more furious. Crucify him! Crucify him! Their cries drowned out all reason, forcing Pilate to confront the inevitable. The walls of the palace seemed to tremble with the intensity of the mob's fury. Amidst the chaos, there was only one who remained remarkably calm, Jesus. Pilate, having made multiple failed attempts to protect him from the wrath of his enemies, now found himself at a crossroads. Desperation clouded his judgment, and in a final act of mercy, he proposed a customary tradition to offer the people a chance to release one prisoner during the festival. I will free Jesus, he suggested, hoping that the people would show mercy to this innocent man. But his proposal was met with deafening cries for his crucifixion. The relentless chants of, crucify him, seemed to pierce the very air. Pilate, seeking to reason with the crowd, tried to argue that their actions were not only unjust but contrary to their own laws. He reminded them that, according to Jewish tradition, no judge could sentence a man to death without first fasting for an entire day. And the sentence required the approval of the Sanhedrin, along with the signature of its president. Furthermore, under their law, executions could not take place on the same day the sentence was pronounced. The following day, the Sanhedrin was required to review the case in full, ensuring a fair trial. Pilate even emphasized that, in the case of a condemned man, a public proclamation was necessary. Someone must stand at the court's door with a banner, and another would ride through the streets announcing the name of the condemned, the crime, and the witnesses, all in the hopes of allowing anyone with evidence to speak in his favor. Additionally, the condemned man was entitled to return up to 3 times to present new arguments in his defense. Pilate's heart ached as he laid out the details of the law before the crowd, hoping that reason would prevail. Yet, despite his efforts, the mob's demand for Jesus' crucifixion did not subside. With a heavy heart, Pilate ordered that Jesus be flogged, convinced that this would satisfy the bloodlust of the crowd. But to his dismay, it only seemed to fan the flames of hatred even more. In a final attempt to distance himself from the judgment, Pilate called for a basin and washed his hands in front of the furious crowd, declaring that, in his judgment, Jesus of Nazareth had done nothing deserving of death. But it was a futile gesture. His words fell on deaf ears. Jesus' fate had already been sealed by the wrath of the mob. Pilate had witnessed uprisings and civil riots in his time as governor, but nothing could have prepared him for the scale of the madness unfolding before him. It felt as though every dark spirit from the depths of hell had descended upon Jerusalem. The crowd did not move as one. They were swept along by an invisible force, a storm of fury that pushed them relentlessly from the gates of the Praetorium to the hill of Mount Zion. Their voices rose in unison, louder than any uproar Pilate had ever witnessed, even during the most volatile uprisings in Pannonia or the Forum in Rome. The day darkened as if it were a winter evening, bringing with it an ominous reminder of another tragic event, the Ides of March. The day Julius Caesar had been slain, Pilate stood alone, a solitary figure in the midst of the tumult, watching with a heavy heart as the innocent Nazarene was led to his execution. The once bustling streets of Jerusalem had emptied, the people flowing like a dark river through the gates of Jamnia. The air hung thick with sorrow, an unsettling silence that clung to the city like a shroud. Pilate's soul seemed to connect with Calvary, the place where the crucifixion was to take place. His thoughts were interrupted by the sounds of agony echoing across Golgotha, carried by the wind, as if announcing a suffering that transcended human comprehension. Above the city, black clouds gathered ominously over the temple, casting a dark shadow across the city. The air seemed to tremble with the weight of something cosmic unfolding. As the earth quaked violently, Pilate felt a chill run through him, as though the very fabric of reality itself was unraveling. The people of Jerusalem, already superstitious, were filled with terror at the strange occurrences that accompanied the death of Jesus. The learned Jew, Bazar from Antioch, who had been a close friend of Jesus, was found dead shortly after the earthquake. It was uncertain whether he had succumbed to the shock of the tremor or the sorrow over the loss of his friend. But his death only added to the growing sense of dread that filled the city. As night began to fall, Pilate wrapped himself in his cloak and made his way into the city. Heading towards the gates of Golgotha, the sacrifice had already been completed, yet the crowd, still in shock, began to disperse. There was a heaviness in the air, a deep sorrow that clung to the people as they slowly returned to their homes. Pilate's small Roman entourage, also visibly shaken, moved silently through the streets. The standard-bearer had draped the Roman eagle in a cloth as a sign of mourning, a symbol of the sadness that hung over the entire city. As he walked, Pilate overheard murmurs from the Jewish soldiers, speaking in hushed tones about the strange miracles they had witnessed, miracles they had never before associated with their gods. As he made his way back to the praetorium, Pilate saw groups of men and women stopping to gaze toward Mount Calvary, their eyes searching for some kind of sign, some final revelation to make sense of the events that had unfolded. When Pilate returned to the praetorium, he climbed the blood-stained stairs, his heart weighed down by the overwhelming sadness of the day. At the top, he saw an elderly man kneeling in prayer, surrounded by Romans who were weeping openly. The sight of an old man weeping was enough to pierce Pilate's soul, and he too found himself overwhelmed by the grief of the moment. The man, his face streaked with tears, threw himself at Pilate's feet, sobbing in sorrow. Pilate, moved by the sight, felt a wave of grief wash over him. He too wept, as did the others gathered around them, all of them united in their mourning. As the crowd of mourners slowly began to thin, the once vocal accusers of Jesus had disappeared, their voices silenced by their own cowardice. Pilate heard rumors that some of those who had so eagerly called for Jesus' crucifixion had washed their mouths with vinegar, perhaps as a twisted acknowledgement of what had been foretold, the resurrection and the separation of the dead. As the crowd dispersed, Pilate finally composed himself and asked, "Father, who are you, and what do you want?" The elderly man raised his head, his tear-streaked face etched with pain. "I am Joseph of Arimathea," he said softly, his voice trembling with sorrow. "I have come to ask for permission to bury Jesus of Nazareth." Pilate, his heart still heavy, granted the request. He instructed his servant, Melis, to accompany Joseph with a small guard to ensure the body would be treated with respect and that no one would desecrate it. Days later, when the tomb was discovered to be empty, whispers began to spread through Jerusalem. Jesus' disciples started claiming that he had risen from the dead, sparking a new wave of fervor and belief among his followers. The resurrection of Jesus stirred up far more commotion than his death had ever done. People across Jerusalem, and even beyond, began to speculate and gossip about what had really happened. Some claimed to have seen Jesus alive, just as he had prophesied, though the truth of the matter remains a mystery. I, Pontius Pilate, took it upon myself to thoroughly investigate the events, hoping to provide clarity to a situation that was anything but clear. Herod claims that Joseph of Arimathea used his own tomb to bury Jesus. But I cannot vouch for whether Joseph had knowledge of, or had somehow planned for, the resurrection in advance. The day after the burial, a concerned priest came to my praetorium, fearing that Jesus' disciples might steal his body and claim that he had risen from the dead as he had foretold. This belief among the disciples was strong, and the priest was worried that such an act would cause even more unrest among the people. In response to his concern, I ordered Marcus, the captain of the guard, to assign enough Jewish soldiers to surround the tomb and keep watch, ensuring that if anything occurred, the responsibility would fall on the Jewish authorities, not the Romans. When I later heard the news of the tomb being found empty, I felt a great unease. To clarify the situation, I spoke with Marcus, who told me that he had assigned Lieutenant Ben Isham and 100 soldiers to guard the tomb. However, Isham's report left me disturbed. He claimed that, during the fourth watch of the night, a strange and mystical light had appeared over the tomb. At first, Isham thought it might have been women coming to embalm Jesus' body, as was customary, but he couldn't understand how they could have passed the guards unnoticed. As he stood there, pondering the situation, the entire area was illuminated by a light that seemed to come from nowhere. What followed, Isham said, was nothing short of miraculous. He He witnessed what appeared to be a multitude of the dead rising from their graves, wrapped in burial shrouds, looking younger, more joyful, and radiant as though they were filled with heavenly light. A music unlike anything he had ever heard filled the air, something so beautiful it felt as if the very sky itself was singing praises to God. Then, the earth began to quake violently, and Isham, overwhelmed by the event, felt his legs give way. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious, not knowing what had happened next. When Isham regained consciousness, I asked him where he found himself. He said he had fallen face down to the earth, his body trembling from the aftershocks of the quake. I questioned whether he might have mistaken the light for the sunrise. But Isham assured me that at the time, the horizon was still dark, far too early for dawn to break. I also inquired whether dizziness from standing too quickly could have caused his collapse. But he explained that he hadn't slept the entire night, as it was punishable by death to sleep on duty. In fact, he had allowed some of his soldiers to rest, though they were still asleep when the strange events unfolded. I continued my questioning, asking Isham how long the light and the strange phenomena lasted. He told me it was hard to say exactly, but he estimated it had been nearly an hour before the daylight gradually overtook the heavenly light, dispelling the eerie glow. When I asked if he had gone to investigate the tomb after he had recovered, Isham replied that he had not. Fearful of the strange occurrence, he and his men returned to the barracks as soon as reinforcements arrived. I further pressed Isham on whether the priests had questioned him about the events. He confirmed that they had, and that they had tried to convince him to say that the earthquake had caused the disturbances, and that the guards had been sleeping at the time. They offered him a bribe to claim that the disciples had stolen the body. But Isham denied seeing any disciples and said he only learned of the body's disappearance later, when others told him about it. I was curious about what the priests believed about Jesus and his nature. So I asked Isham about the opinions of those he had spoken to. Some priests, he said, had come to believe that Jesus was not an ordinary man, not even human in the way others were. According to them, Jesus was a figure who had appeared at various points in history, during the time of Abraham and Lot, and in other places and eras, suggesting he was a being of divine nature rather than a mere mortal. If this theory is true, it aligns with much of what we know about Jesus' life and his extraordinary deeds. Both his friends and enemies alike recognized that Jesus seemed to have control over nature itself. It was as if he could shape the world around him, much like a potter shaping clay. He turned water into wine at a wedding, healed the sick, raised the dead, calmed storms with a word, and even made fish appear with coins in their mouths. These were not acts of ordinary men. They were miracles that could not be explained away by simple logic or coincidence. It is no wonder that Jesus became such a figure of intense controversy. He wasn't accused of typical crimes, such as breaking laws or physically harming anyone. Instead, his deeds, witnessed by thousands, were the source of deep hatred. And it is clear that these acts, performed with divine power, contributed to the animosity that led to his crucifixion. In the end, I find myself agreeing with the words spoken by a bystander at the cross. Truly, this was the Son of God. Everything about Jesus, his life, his works, and even his final moments, pointed to something beyond human understanding. Pilate himself, as a man accustomed to dealing with emperors and gods, could not ignore the profound impression Jesus left on the world. As for Jesus' appearance, accounts from those who encountered him describe a man unlike any other. Pilate himself spoke of Jesus as an impressive figure, someone of average height, with a calm demeanor and a powerful presence that drew the attention of all around him. His face conveyed an inner peace, even during the most intense moments, and his expression was one of quiet strength and understanding. Jesus had long, soft hair, which fell in gentle waves around his shoulders. It was a light brown, almost blonde, which was unusual for someone from that region. His eyes were described as striking, deep, piercing, and capable of conveying both wisdom and kindness. They seemed to change color, varying from light brown to blue, depending on the light and the observer's perspective. Those who looked into his eyes were often struck by the sense of profound understanding that radiated from them. His skin was fair, with a smooth, healthy appearance, like someone who had spent much time outdoors but still took care of themselves. His face was symmetrical and considered beautiful by those who met him. But it was not merely a superficial beauty. His features conveyed authority, but without being overbearing or threatening. He wore a full, well-kept beard that added a sense of maturity and respect to his appearance. Though his clothing was simple, it was always dignified. He wore a long robe and tunic, modest but clean, with no flashy jewelry or adornments. This reflected his detachment from material wealth and his focus on higher spiritual matters. His very presence, without the need for words, radiated peace, humility, and an invitation for others to approach him with open hearts. Now, noble sovereign, this is the most detailed and accurate account I can provide regarding the events surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection. I have made every effort to present the facts with clarity so that you may judge my actions with fairness. I acknowledge that much criticism has been directed at me over this matter. And I remain, with utmost loyalty and respect, your obedient servant. If you enjoyed this account and wish to learn more about these mysteries, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel and click on the video displayed on your screen to discover further truths like these.